Hello, I'm Gareth Thomas speaking to you at the moment from my bedroom. Today we're going to be reviews again, this time on DVDs, and this time it's a big selection of DVDs. Where it's from a series called Racing Through Time, where they do all the history and stuff of motor racing, which includes Formula 1 and sports cars. And it's quite a good amount of history. And these DVDs are worth watching, which I'll give to you. So the first one is the history of Grand Prix racing. And these are the first of 20 slides that I've made for this video. So the history of Grand Prix racing, it starts basically around the 20s and 30s, and then I haven't seen the video in years, but I have seen it. It is worth watching. Starts around 20s, 30s, goes on in the 50s, goes all the way up to when the video was made, which was in 2002, and it gives good insight on how Grand Prix racing was up until that point. Now, with the budget cap and the V6 hybrids, it makes things very different compared to the days when the video was made, when they were doing V10s, goodness, with how many RPMs, maybe up to 20,000 RPMs at one point, and I have to say it's quite good. Obviously, would I recommend a video? Yes, it's a good lecture to go through on how good Formula 1 Grand Prix motor racing is. Is it good to look about the history? Yes, because that is very good to know what you need to know. And obviously all 20 of these videos are DVDs, so it's worth watching. And obviously it gives all behind the scenes on how the teams manage stuff at the end. This one is the next one, which is the history of Le Mans. For people that don't know, Le Mans is a 24-hour car race that goes on from a time that starts on Saturday up until the time that finishes on Sunday. 24 hours straight, no bedtime for the drivers, because they'd be, unless they have some sleep, because it is impossible to sleep, especially during the night when there's cars still going around. First run in 1923, the cars were all, they originally went through the city around to the countryside and then back around. They diverted the route and then they got their own road, which has now become the Bugatti circuit, which is the short circuit, and then they still use the traditional long circuit. It's a very good DVD. Like the first one. Is it worth watching? Yes. Is it good for education? Yeah. Is it worth seeing? Yeah. Because all the knowledge on Le Mans is on there. First race in 1923. They look at every year history, including all the information, previous winners. Also, sadly, features the Le Mans disaster of 1955, where PLV and over 80 spectators lost their lives. It also features how Le Mans came back after the Second World War, because it was a gap of 10 to 11 years between 1939 to 1949, where there was no racing, and then they came back in 49. Is it worth watching? Yeah. Are the cars beautiful? Yeah. Like the Formula 1 cars, they are beautiful, and it gives a good insight on how Le Mans type endurance racing is. The cars don't stop at night, they keep on going 24 hours straight. So, next video, I've got it on 2 images for a very good reason. It's great circuits, and that's the DVD on the left. The images on the circuit is on the right. So, What's about? About 3 good circuits that motor racing has visited. The first one is Silverstone, which is the home of the British Grand Prix. The image on the left side image, the first one on the left, but that one was the layout between 97 and 2009, 1997 to 2009, but obviously it's got a new layout ever since. And obviously Silverstone, very good circuit, very fast, and not only that, it's fearless by the drivers. The middle one on that second image is the Nürburgring. That is the current layout now, but they look at the history of the original Nürburgring. For people that don't know, it's a 14-mile Nordschleife. It's still around today, but I can tell you that it's very good, challenging and demanding, having driven it on Gran Turismo Sport, and I have to say it's rather good to drive. The third and final one is Monaco. Obviously similar layout to what it is now. Obviously Monaco is known for being very challenging, difficult to overtake, but it's a crown jewel event, being with Le Mans and the Indy 500. Are these videos worth to watch? Yes, because you get the history of all 3 circuits, how good the circuits were, and how good they really were back in the day. And for those that were wondering why it says Nürburgring on the Monaco layout and Monaco on the Nürburgring layout, it's because, if I can do that there was an editing error by one of the graphic editors, and they had to make do with that. But I have to say, a good video, worth watching, very good to know your knowledge. Page 4, the second part. Obviously, if you notice, the image on the left is a layout from Sepang, from Le Former, and then on your right is the circuits where they look at the Spa-Francorchamps and the Monza circuit. Obviously, back in when they first went round, Monza had no chicanes when they first went. Spa was like 14 kilometres, 8 or so miles, and it wasn't as fast. The Eau Rouge, that it was obviously was not built at the time. It wasn't built to 39, and some of the faster kinks weren't built until after the Second World War. Obviously, Monza, they implemented chicanes after 1971 when Peter Geffen won the fastest ever Grand Prix, and they've upgraded it ever since. Spa, on the other hand, their history came with safety concerns. Obviously, 1969 was boycotted, a chicane was added in one of the areas in 1970. They tried to use a chicane in one of the areas for sports car racing. 75, 5 years after Formula 1 did their last Grand Prix there on the original layout, but they thought the chicane was a death trap. Looks at the history of how good of 2 Formula 1's historic events are like. Obviously, Spa, as you know, that is the current layout. Obviously, these videos were recorded in the early 2000s when actually, I think Spa was actually the last version before the changes for 2007, which they used ever since. But I can't see because the image is not great. But let me know about that. Obviously, is it worth watching? Yeah. Why? Because it gives out the history of Monza, the history of Spa, what it was like back in the 20s and 30s, what it was like in the 50s and 60s. Do I like those circuits? Yeah. Fearless and challenging, but it was also feared by the drivers. and also produced some rather spectacular racing. Now back to the single images, where we're on page 5, and this time we look at the teams that have competed in Formula 1 and sports cars. First one, Alfa Romeo. It was raced in the 30s, and at one point a certain Enzo Ferrari became its racing manager. Ferrari tried to enter it under its own team, but Alfa Romeo overruled him, and that's when Ferrari left and formed his own company. And then there was Alfa in the late 40s, and even up until 1951 when Alfa was still dominant, and then Alfa Sportscars as well in that era as well. And then when they briefly mentioned about Alfa's Formula 1 efforts between 1979 and 1985, they also talked about Alfa's engines in Formula 1. But because it was recorded in the early 2000s, it does not mention current Alfa Romeo Formula 1, which Alfa purchased the name and rights off the Sauber Formula 1 team. Is it good education of Alfa Romeo in the past? Yeah. Worth good amount of money to what it's worth everyone's money to watch. Quite entertaining, good history about Alfa Romeo, good history of its drivers, which won 2 world championships back to back in 1950 and 51. 1950 with Giuseppe Nino Farina, and 1951 with Juan Manuel Fangio. Worth watching because the history, and that, but obviously I would recommend watching them because the more the info you get on the knowledge, the more useful it can be later on. Next one is where Ferrari, the most famous name in motor racing, is about. Ferrari was formed after Enzo Ferrari had a falling out with Alfa Romeo. And this is a video on how Ferrari performed basically as a manager before forming his own team, and showing them in the 50s and 60s. Lots of famous drivers in Alfa. No, not Alfa, Ferrari even. Yeah, I got myself confused. Ferrari drivers, obviously, and this was made in 2002, so they don't mention current day stuff. Lots of drivers that won the titles, including Sky back-to-back 52-53, Fangio in 56, Hawthorne 58, Phil Hill 1961, John Surtees in 1964, Niki Lauda in 1975 and 1977, Jody Scheckter in 1979, and Michael Schumacher in the early 2000s when he wiped the floor with everybody else. Talks about the history of the video, talks about the history of Ferrari and how good it is, and obviously talks about the Cromatory, Enzo Ferrari himself. Is it worth watching? Yeah. Good about the history of Ferrari back in the day, of what it was like before it entered Formula 1. The knowledge of the cars, the passion that Enzo Ferrari had when he saw or listened to, because they had radios back in the 50s before it went on television, and then everything went well. These two, Alfa and Ferrari, will later be sold to Fiat, to the Fiat Motor Company, but Enzo Ferrari was still manager of Ferrari's racing team, as he was still put in charge by Fiat. So obviously Ferrari still doing F1 today, and their last driver's title was way back in 2007 with Kimi Raikkonen. Maserati, the last of the 3 Italian giants that will later be sold to Fiat and the Fiat Corporation. Maserati was formed by the Maserati brothers, where they built such good racing cars, and they raced in the 30s, and then war broke out, and then raced again after the war, and then in the 50s they were in midfield, and then in 54 Fangio drove for them for 2 races before joining Mercedes-Benz. That helped Fangio get his second of his 5 world titles. Then also during 54, Sterling drove a privateer Maserati bought by his father and his manager, and because he was so impressive he joined the works team, and then Moss's commitments led him to leave Maserati to join Mercedes, but then came back after Mercedes pulled out in 56, and in 57 Moss left Maserati after 1 race to drive for Vanwall, as Vanwall didn't compete in Argentina because of the high cost of travelling, and at the same time Fangio rejoined Maserati to get title number 5. Maserati has been involved in other road and race car projects, but because it's owned by Fiat, I expect it's going to be quite good to see how good the road cars are, and obviously since Maserati are no longer involved in F1 since the 50s, it proves that they were the underdogs. Is it worth watching? Yeah. Good about the history of Maserati. It's good money for value, like the other 6 videos that I've talked about. Good about the history of Maserati in Formula 1. And why I like it is because it's a good amount of history regarding these videos, especially with the history. Next one, the first of the multiple amounts of teams from Britain. First one, Aston Martin. Formed after the Second World War, team started sports car racing in the early 50s, competing against Jaguar, as well as Ferrari and loads of other teams. It included, as the team was managed by David Brown and his corporation, and for people that don't know, David Brown, he was he owned a farming business but was a fan of motor racing, and it took Aston Martin quite a long time to win Le Mans in 59. They also talked about Aston Martin's efforts in F1, which was a disaster in 59 and 60, but their second spell, which starts this year, is not mentioned in the video because the video was made in 2002. So, is it good watching? Yeah, good about the history about Aston Martin. They show about the history, the racing, shows how much it took for them to win Le Mans, and shows how downhill they went in Formula 1. Will they go downhill this year in their second try? No one knows. In the end, we have to wait and see. But in the end, I think Aston Martin will do better than what they did in the 50s. Obviously, Aston Martin also did sports cars like Maserati, Ferrari and Alfa did. And quite a lot of famous names drove for them. Next one, Jaguar. Also formed after the Second World War. They did sports cars, obviously, and then they won Le Mans in 1951. A disaster 52 when the cars broke down. 53 they won, in probably the most infamous story of all time, when it was alleged that both Tony Walt and Duncan Hamilton, who shared the cars, were driving absolutely under the influence of alcohol. And if they were caught, I expect no go. 1954 finished second to Ferrari in a very exciting finish. 55 they won despite the tragedy of the Le Mans disaster. Won in 56 as a works team, then pulled out as a works team at the end of the year. But then they raced in 57 as a privateer under Kieran Carson won. And obviously they talked about a little bit about Jaguar's return in the 80s, which will feature in another DVD that I'll show you later on. Talks about Jaguar's history in F1 between 2000 and up to the recording. In 2002, Jaguar later to sell to Red Bull, and proves how good Red Bull were later on. And it doesn't feature Jaguar in Formula E because Formula E wasn't filmed until 2014 and Jaguar didn't come in until quite later on. Is it good to watch? Yeah. Good value for money. Talks about the history of drivers that drove in Jaguar, including Moss, and so many good drivers. Good value for money, good history about Jaguar, worth watching. Next one, Cooper, the first British team to win a Formula 1 World Championship. Apart from Vanwell, obviously, because Vanwell, I don't think they made a video about Vanwell, but I know Cooper has a good amount of history with 500cc racing to racing in Formula 1 with the first rear engines, back-to-back titles, the V12s with Maserati, and the sudden collapse. They spoke to John Cooper, who managed the team at the time, and they talked about the back-to-back championships driving constructors with Jack Brabham and what Cooper achieved in 59-60. And they talked about how complex the gearbox was. Because it was a rear engine, they didn't know anyone that made a gearbox for them, so they had to build their own, and they had to change it every single race because it effectively was unknown. Worth watching, yeah. Good value for money, good history about the Cooper car company, and even they made the Mini Cooper, which was effectively a side project of the Cooper car company. I have to say it is worth watching, and I would certainly recommend it. We're 22 minutes in, there's quite a lot more to go. As we head to page 11, and Lotus. Lotus has a reputation of being innovators. So, formed out of garages by Colin Chapman, having borrowed 50 quid off his wife, and turned it into one of the most successful and most innovative Formula 1 teams of all time. They entered club racing before entering F1. They also did sports cars for a time, but their innovations. Drivers such as Hill, Clark, Andretti, Fittipaldi drove for Lotus and won the World Drivers' title. Lots of other famous names drove for them, but Colin Chapman was more famous on his innovations. That included using a monocoque car instead of a space frame car in 1962 with a Lotus 25, and then first car that could take the engine into the chassis as a three-struts member with the Lotus 43 in 1966, but it was later implemented in the Lotus 49 in 67, using the Cosworth DFV engine in 67. First car to use side pods in 1970, which Jochen Rindt won the title, sadly posthumously. And then obviously other innovations including the sequential gearbox failure of the Lotus 76 and the four-wheel drive failure of the Lotus 63. Also Chapman's efforts at, brief mention about Chapman's efforts at Indianapolis, where Lotus won in 65 with Jim Clark. And not only that, back to Formula 1 with innovations. Lotus' grand effect in the late 70s, which propelled Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson to dominate 78, with Andretti winning from Peterson, who was posthumously second after his Monza accident. And then 1981 happened, and Chapman had outrage with other teams because of Chapman's Lotus 88, which was a twin chassis, one chassis pushing the car to the ground, the other one being a driver smoothly going through. That was banned, and then Chapman innovated the first active suspension, but sadly Chapman died before you could see it. And then the infamous DeLorean scandal, which Chapman was a part of, some of you may not know, Chapman was involved in designing cars for John DeLorean, where effectively they swindled millions out of then Prime Minister Thatcher. So effectively, this video goes from when it started up until the late 60s, but I would not recommend having someone like Chapman involved in your bank accounts. That's my top tip. Next one, drivers. First one, the GOAT of Formula 1, the original one, Juan Manuel Fangio. And why I say the original GOAT? Because he was 5 times Formula 1 World Champion for 4 different teams. His first world title came in 1951 for Alfa Romeo at the age of 40 years old. He was born in Balcarce, Argentina, raced before the Second World War, then the war happened and raced again after the Second World War. Got 51 title, 52 he basically couldn't race because he broke a vertebrae in his neck at Monza. 53 won 1 race at Monza, and then 54 won the title in both Maserati and then the Mercedes because he could. Dominated in 55 with the Mercedes, and then Mercedes pulled out, drove for Ferrari, and it was a fractious relationship with Enzo Ferrari, which still gave Fangio his 4th world title. Went back to Maserati, captured his 5th world title, including his famous drive at the Nürburgring, and his few races in 58, which he retired after the French Grand Prix. Fangio was an influence to so many people worth watching, yeah, because Fangio was F1's 4th original great. There's several other greats since then with Schumacher, Prost, Senna and Hamilton. Fangio was the original, and that's why other drivers look to guys like him and Schumacher and Hamilton on why they deserve to be top at the best. And back then they had goggles and a helmet or a cap. It wouldn't be allowed now because of the safety. But certainly Fangio was one of the best. It's worth watching, great money for value, and it's good education. This next one is one of Fangio's greatest rivals and a personal friend of his, the late great Sir Stirling Moss. Obviously Stirling came from a racing background. Obviously his parents were race drivers. His sister was a driver and later married a rally driver herself. Stirling went to car racing, did his first F1 race in 1951, then in 54 his father bought a Maserati and painted it green because Stirling was a British driver, beat the works cars, and then invited to drive the works team. And then in Monza he led from Fangio's Mercedes and the car broke down, and that was good for Albert Neubauer of Mercedes for Moss to join Fangio, where most of the time Moss would usually finish second, but the British Grand Prix Moss won, and Fangio said, "It was your day, the British Grand Prix was yours." Moss returned to Maserati in 56, came second again for the second year, second again in 57, driving for Fenwell, and then gave Cooper his first rear engine victory in 58, but then returned to Fenwell because Fenwell, like it did in 57, as it would in 58, skip Argentina because of the costs. And then he won 3 more races in, trying to remember, the Dutch Grand Prix, the Portuguese Grand Prix and the Moroccan Grand Prix, but he still lost the title to Mike Hawthorne by 1 point. Moss's retirements caused problems in 58, whereas Hawthorne was only able to score one win and so many seconds and thirds. Moss would finish third in the championship in 59 through to 61, but then an accident that basically ended his driving career. But he would later be involved in stuff like gadgets and property. A great man and a great influence to British motorsport back in the day. Good to watch, is worth everything to watch. Next one, Jack Brabham. So, yeah, Brabham came from Australia, and he really did a lot of dirt track racing, and that's where his driving style came from. And basically, that's where he learned his true driving style from, and then joined John Cooper and his team to build the rear engine car that would dominate 1959-60. In 1962, Brabham left Cooper to join his own team, where he would win the 1966 world title and then sell his shares in the team when he retired in 1970. Great influence, the only man to win the title and win the constructor's title in a car of his own. Obviously, the Brabham team would clinch 4 drivers' titles, one for Brabham in 66, one for Denny Ulmer in 67, and 2 more in the early 80s with Nelson Piquet when the team was managed and owned by a certain Bernie Eccleston. Was it good under the days? Yeah, when Brabham raced. Good information about his history, the way that he did as a driver and as an owner. And it had a big impact on the sport. And I know some of you might be thinking I might be waffling on because it's half an hour or so in the video, but a true influence, worth quite a lot of money, worth every penny to watch, and it's worth watching because it's very good. Next one, the only man to win the Triple Crown, Graham Hill. So, worked as a mechanic, born in London, and then got offered a drive by Grant Chapman in exchange for him working on his own car, and then got into Formula 1 in 58, driving for Lotus in 58 and 59, was not happy with the reliability, drove for BRM in 1960, and won the world title in 62, but there was other occasions he could have won, obviously, but then in 66 Hill went to the Indy 500 and won on his first try. And famously, Hill said that there was no cubicles in the toilets. And for those that don't know, is that the cubicles are the doors when you head to the toilets, and the Americans were not happy. In 68, Hill had to lead the team through its most darkest times after the death of Jim Clark, but Hill won the title. 69, Hill won Monaco for the 5th and final time, but smashed both his legs up after a crash in Watkins Glen. He recuperated and recovered and got himself back in a car in South Africa 5 months after the accident. Nowadays, no way would the medical authorities would allow a driver to get in. And he showed everyone why he was still at his best, driving a Wob Walker Lotus after leaving Grant Chapman's works team, having driven for them for 3 years. At the end of 1970, Wob Walker pulled out and Jack Brabham signed Hill before Brabham sold his shares to Ron Torlak. In 71 and 72, it was so hard for Hill that he left the team at the end of 72 to form his own team, Embassy Hill. No points in 73, driving a Shadow. 1 point for him in 74, driving the Lola T370. In 1975, they used the T370 before it was replaced by the T371, which would later be renamed the Hill GH1 after Andy Smallman, who designed the cars, left Lola to work with Hill. Hill retired from driving after Monaco, but to focus mostly on management, but at the end of 1975, tragedy struck where Hill, his driver through most of 75 and who was going to drive for him in 76, Tony Price. Smallman, who designed the new GH2 car, which they were testing at Paul Ricard, and 3 other members were flying away from Paul Ricard down to Elstree Airport. The team basically were there testing. They left Paul Ricard, and through that, sadly, the plane crashed, killing everyone on board. But because the car and the equipment were on a transporter back to the factory, that was not damaged. But because Hill had no insurance and his pilot license was expired, the other families sued Hill's widow, Betty. Eventually, they had to seize everything because of that. But eventually, they did make the Hill name would make its mark again when Graham's son Damon was involved in motor racing and would later become a world champion himself in 1996. But Graham Hill, obviously one of motor racing's first, they were basically first flyer moustaches. Very quick but also very humorous. Next one, the racing years, the 1950s. With this, it basically talks about motor racing in the 50s, how it was done at the time, and how they did it. Costs were cheaper, it was just as good and as entertaining to watch, but sadly we lost a lot of drivers back then. Also features stuff such as the Le Mans disaster and other stuff, but in the end a good video to watch, like the one that I mentioned about Graham Hill, because they're both money for value, both very good information and good sources to get information on. The 1960s talks about stuff in the 60s. The 50s was all about front engines before switching to rear engines. This one talked about Ford versus Ferrari, Lotus's domination, and how everything turned to sponsorship. And it was so good, so much money for value, so good on information, it's worth watching. 70s. This one is like the other two, worth money for value, worth watching. However, it's from 1970 to 1975 because it's shortened for that. And because of the video being so long, they decided to just do it for that. Features how innovation was still at the forefront, safety was the main priority, and lots of stuff. Good money for value, good to watch, and good entertainment. Last but one, sportscars of the 70s. Now, it's about how John Wyer's Porsche team, who switched from Ford GT40s over to the Porsche 917s, dominated sports car racing in 1970 and 71. And then in 72, the 3 litre limit came in. That means teams like Matra would dominate, and so on. And then 1975, John Wyer retired, and that meant teams would battle for so many good racing. Good history, good education, good to watch because it's so good, easily to watch. And my god, they were so good, so fast. And the last one, from the 80s, the cat came back. And this is about Jaguar's dramatic return to Le Mans, on how Jaguar came back under Tom Walkinshaw's TWR effort and basically turned it around. They last came in as a works team in 1956, and the last win was 1957, but they won in 1988. But they did touring cars first and that before going back to sports cars. And then won in 88, won in 1990, where Aston Martin Brundle drove, and then Jaguar pulled out in 1991, citing the rising costs. Because back then costs were around the same as Formula 1 around that time. Worth watching, good value for money, and it shows how Jaguar chose to increase its mark by winning a 24-hour race once more 30 years or so after it was. Remember to like, share, subscribe. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Snap, and YouTube to watch. There's more content. Obviously, if you want to see a very good to watch, I would recommend seeing all these DVDs because they're some of the best to get you knowledge about motor racing. And certainly, I would recommend it. I'm Gareth Thomas. Obviously, it was such a good video to go through, 40 odd minutes or so. I think this would be worth your time to look through the videos, watch them. But I haven't mentioned any other videos because I don't know if there was any more. But if there is, I'll have a look and post it on YouTube as soon as possible. I'll make this video as available as possible of the video that I've made for you guys, so that you guys can see in full. Goodbye.